G'day, it's Oscar, and this is question number 9. Comes from Neil, who asked this question, which was fascinating for me. It was, Oscar, I've heard you talk about listening to what's unsaid at level 4 in the 5 levels of listening model. I get how I can do that in a one-on-one conversation. I understand how I can say, tell me more, what else, and those kinds of questions. Oscar, how do you do it in a group? How do you do it in a group workshop where I've got 40 people in the room, there's 5 people, there's tables of 8? How do I, as the host, listen for what's unsaid? I'm really struggling to make sense of how to do this. Great question, Neil. 3 quick tips for you to think about in terms of surfacing what's unsaid. Now, number 1 is ask people when they move into their breakout groups at their tables to discuss a particular issue, to think about the ratio of questions to statements that they might make in the discussion. Be deliberate. Invite the people to a specific ratio of, while you're at your tables and you're really passionate about a topic, ask 50% questions and then 50% statements. That's a good base level to start off with, Neil, when it comes to getting the table to start to listen to what's not said in the balance of the people. So if you've got 5 people and 50% of the time they're asking questions, definitely going to surface a lot more unsaid than if you don't be directive about how to dialogue. Quite often in these breakouts, people will be very specific on the task that needs to be performed. What is to be discussed? What is to be created as an output? Typically, it sounds something like this. At your tables, discuss this issue, and we'll invite you to summarize what you've agreed on at the table. Although this is handy, what tends to happen in the dynamic? Louder voices, more dominant or influential people in the organization will steer the conversation in a particular direction. That's really not surfacing what's unsaid. So tip number 1, Neil, is be directive to the group when you send them. 50% questions, 50% statements. Tip number 2, rather than getting people to break out at tables and summarize everything up to the table, you could summarize up to the room. And what I find really useful is these wonderful colored sticky notes. Now, a lot of people don't put enough pre-thought into the sticky notes. Sticky notes themselves can surface patterns. And when I do this exercise, for example, we'll get everybody in the room to put up their sticky notes. And what I might say is, if you've got a point to make about customers, make it green. If you've got a point to make about internal processes, consider this purple color. Now, what happens as people put up their sticky notes? Neil, it's a really obvious pattern emerges. It tends to skew in one direction or another. In this particular case, you might get more internal feedback rather than summaries or perspectives from customers. Now, in regard to internal systems versus customers, I don't know what the right ratio is, but if your organization is saying that customer centricity is their focus, I'd invite the group to reflect on the pattern they see rather than me judging it, and ask them, is that the pattern you'd expect to see from a customer-centric organization? There seems to be a smaller ratio of the green customer sticky notes compared to the purple sticky notes in there. And invite the group just to discuss that particular issue. Finally, tip number 3, use the physicality of the people present. Use that to play with what's said and what's not said in the room. So a simple example of this is when it comes to setting up a room with 40 people, 8 tables, 5 people per table, you may be deliberate in mixing up the tables, or you may not. You may allow the tables to organically move and choose their own locations. I once did a workshop where the brief was, Oscar, I need you to surface the silos in the organization. So as a result, what I did was I ensured that organic was the way that everybody sat at their tables. Then I asked the leaders at that table to stand up and explain what division department they were from. Next, I asked everybody sitting at that table if they were from the same division or department to also stand up. What became evident very quickly was everybody had clustered into their internal silos. Again, it wasn't my job to point it out. I merely asked the room to explore if cross-group collaboration was something that was really important to our organization. What does this pattern of where people are sitting tell us about collaboration? Now, I hope those 3 tips have helped. Tip number 1, when you move people into breakouts, be directive and get them to ask questions 50% of the time as a guideline. Tip number 2, use some patterns to surface what's happening in the dialogue. I find sometimes the quickest way to do that is simply with sticky notes. And then tip number 3, where are people actually sitting? This can be the most influential thing for you to understand what's said and what's not said. It's no surprise that you will get a wider, more diverse perspective of questions if the groups are mixed up rather than them staying together. I'm Oscar Trimboli, and along with the Deep Listening Ambassadors, we're on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the world. You've given us the greatest gift of all. You've listened to us. Thanks for listening.